What I want to do is just talk a little bit about the psychology of eye tracking. I'm a developmental and educational psychologist. I study children's cognition and learning, and recently actually started doing some eye tracking studies with multimedia learning, which I'm going to show you at the end of my little talk. So there's a long history of using looking as a construct in psychology. Sorry, I need my notes. We know that people focus on information in a scene that they find informative. They'll also look at strange or unexpected objects that kind of attract attention. And so I think of eye tracking as sort of being the next generation of this long history of just looking at looking. And as a developmental psychologist, where this comes in very handy, in particular, are with participants who can't really tell you what they're doing, like infants. And so there's been, as was mentioned in the last talk, decades of research looking at infants and what do they look at. And so I want to talk about what we infer from where kids look. All right. So some examples from developmental psychology where we use the looking paradigm, as our measure. One is the habituation paradigm. So basically, you show an infant something until they get bored of it, and then you change it in some way and see if they start looking at it again. And this is used to figure out, do infants can they detect the difference that you're making? And I have a little video of a version of that. Another example is the preferential looking, which is what's pictured here, where you show two images and just look to see where the kid looks. So when I was an undergrad student, part of my research assistant duties involved sitting down, looking at tapes of kids to say, are they looking left or right? And I couldn't see what they're looking at, but I had to sit there, code, okay, for the last 20 seconds they were looking left, now they're looking right, and so on. So this is, having done hours and hours of that, I'm very happy to have an eye tracker now that does that all automatically. One of the ways that this preferential looking paradigm, it's yielded some interesting results. So this is a study where with a young infant who can't speak yet, they're saying things like the man is talking or something like that. And so you have a woman, I can't see what they're actually doing, but you have a woman on one screen and a man on the other, and if you say the man is talking, the infant will orient towards the man rather than the woman. And so this shows that at whatever age, 9 months, the kids can actually tell the difference between man and woman, and they'll do it with other terms as well. This is a famous study. Let's see if it works.
Six-month-old Matthew sits on his mother's lap. A researcher sits opposite and keeps his attention on a colorful toy while a tape plays two sounds. One is ba, and the other is da, a sound only used in Hindi, and one which most English-speaking listeners can't distinguish from the English sound da. During the initial training period, a toy bunny is lit up in a large glass box to the side of Matthew the instant the da sound is played. When the ba sound is played, the bunny stops, and Matthew turns back to the researcher. The routine continues until Matthew learns to associate the change from ba to da with the bunny. Matthew even turns his head in anticipation when the researchers delay the bunny's appearance. Matthew is now ready for the test phase of the experiment. A new tape is played, this time with two different da sounds that are only used in Hindi. Even though they are two completely different sounds, an adult who can't speak Hindi doesn't hear the difference. But But Matthew immediately turns his head towards the bunny when he hears the change from one Hindi da to the other. Although he has never heard Hindi spoken, researchers recognize that at 6 months, he is still the universal listener, able to distinguish all sounds. Emma, who is 4 months older than Matthew, has come to the lab for the first time. After a similar training routine as Matthew, she's presented with the same problem of distinguishing the two different Hindi da sounds. But at this age, Emma, whose parents speak only English, doesn't react when there is a change from one to the other. She is more interested in the toy in front of her than the bunny. This leads the researchers to conclude that by 10 months, the baby human stops being the universal listener and, like the adult of the species, no longer hears the difference between the two sounds.
Okay. So that was, a very famous study in psychology that I always show that video to my students when I'm teaching language development because it's a really neat phenomena. Coincidentally, it's also the finding that was behind the Baby Einstein, first Baby Einstein video, where they would have, they said, oh, it's terrible, these kids can no longer distinguish between sounds in different languages, and so let's have them listen to a whole bunch of different languages, which is not good, because it's actually part of the reason why you want to stop making those distinctions is so that you can actually lump together the distinction and make the distinctions that are important in your language and ignore these other ones that are not important in your language. Anyway, that's just aside. So that's one of the uses of the eye tracking, looking with these looking at gaze, using looking as the measure to get at something a little more complicated that we couldn't directly ask the kids because they can't talk. So why do we track eyes? As we heard from the last talk, eye tracking has been around for quite some time. We know that one of the first findings that looking at eyes was looking at reading and finding that it's not actually a smooth process, but kind of a jerky process. Jarvis, who spoke about in the previous talk, said that eye movements reflects human thought process. So the observer's thought may be followed to some extent from records of eye movement. It is easy to determine from these records which elements track the observer's eyes and consequently his thoughts, in what order and how often. So again, it's linking gaze, tracking the eyes to try to get at the cognition, to try to get at thought. Just to sort of, so those are the two things we measure, the saccades, the movements, and then the fixation points. Those are the observable behaviors, and then we kind of infer from that what we're getting at is visual attention. So that's defined by the observation, and then we further abstract from that a whole host of inferred variables, everything from preference to language comprehension to math abilities. They've done studies with infants, and they're looking, arguing that infants have an innate knowledge of mathematics, emotions, and a whole lot of other things. But it all hinges on these two observable measures, looking and moving your eyes. Eye tracking has been used with in psychology, a number of measures, including reading text, driving, looking at driving, reading of music, and interaction with multimedia material. And generally, what gets done is we have participants do this activity, and then you look for systematic differences between two groups, often novices and experts, and then infer this is what's learned. So in reading, this is one of the most common uses of eye tracking in psychology. You find consistent differences in the duration of fixation, durations of saccades, the frequency of fixations, and the frequency of regressions, which is going back to look at text that you've already passed. So here's just a quick tracking of reading some text that I think came with our eye tracker. And so you can see a very systematic, scanning of the text, and then they kind of get bored in a minute of reading, and then they go up and start looking at the pictures. And as with humans, in the you see the fixation on the eyes and the mouth. So even with the faces of the polar bear, I find a similar, maybe top-down approach to processing the face. Reading music, similarly, we find differences between novices and readers, which I'm going to skip since I lost a whole lot of time. Driving, you find that, using eye tracking, they found that expert drivers will look at more places, and novice drivers tend to fixate for longer with fewer points. So these, again, informs when you're teaching someone how to drive, you want to tell them, okay, make sure you look at all these points, not just fixate on one point. So it helps inform teaching when you start getting this kind of information. Use of multimedia. This is sort of a newer area of interest. It's a near interest of mine. It answers questions such as, it's been used probably more in the commercial field, where people want to know, okay, is my advertising working? Are people getting the information? Are they looking at what I want them to look at? But it's starting to have an influence on education research as well. It answers questions such as information flow. How do people process a web page? Usually a designer will have a clear idea of how they want you to go through the web page. If it's not well designed, then you see people bouncing all over the place. It's also been used in providing feedback for in development of video games. So they have players play a game. If there's an area where people can't get past, they'll see, okay, people are fixating on this rock up there that's really irrelevant, so we have to do something so that they don't focus their attention on that. And in my own research, we've been trying to develop science-based simulations, multimedia simulations, for teaching low prior knowledge learners, so learners that don't know a lot about the field, which is chemistry. And so we've been starting to use, we've done a lot of research just looking at the learning with these materials, and now we're starting to use eye tracking to see how are the learners actually using the materials. So these data were collected yesterday, so it's very raw, but I just wanted to, I got excited by it and wanted to kind of share. So this is just introduction to the simulation. When we were testing in schools, this is from a project that's been going on for several years, we found that no matter how clear the instructions that we gave, we always had to tell them. And so we thought they weren't actually reading the instructions. And as of yesterday, we find out, each one of these is a different participant, by the way. And it's just, so we found out that, in fact, yes, they are reading it, they just don't comprehend it. So that suggests either, with our low prior knowledge learners here, we either have to go back and rework our text or give up on it altogether. Okay. And then just, sorry, 2 minutes so I can wrap up. This is a participant who we're calling novice. They didn't really know a lot about the subject area. They're all high school students, but they didn't know much about the subject area. And you see, once they can't even figure out exactly how to get through the start screen. But once they do, they're kind of bouncing around a little bit. They're really focusing on these little moving balls, which are supposed to be molecules, which is attractive, but not necessarily where you're getting the information from. And there's some movement. This is a chart. So what happens is this is a simulation of a gas chamber to teach the ideal gas law. The idea that we had was to add some iconic representations of pressure, temperature, and volume to help the novice learners. And they are looking at these things, so that's good. But and sort of looking over at the graph. But this I think from this, inferring that we need to work more on trying to integrate this information back and forth. If I go to our expert user, and I put expert in quotes because it's still a high school kid, they're actually reading it, so that's a good sign. And figure out rather quickly to click the go button. There is some looking at, again, at the little blue dots, but you see a more systematic approach of changing one of the variables, and then looking over at the graph. See, there. So we do see some approach. And to analyze these kind of data, what we'll do is identify areas, regions of interest, and such as the icons and then the graph, and then look for differences between how kids who scored highly on the pretest and low on the pretest, how they interact differently, and then use that to inform our future designs so that we can get those kids that aren't not doing well with it doing even better using these simulations. And then this is just some future directions, but I'm out of time, so I'll just leave that up there.
So I'll start it with a question or two, but then I'd like to, again, open it to you for questions. And please do use the microphone. I'd appreciate it very much for sound quality. Bruce, I'm going to refer back to the film that Graham Weinbrunn produced. The first time I saw the film, I immediately loved it. A very beautiful sort of caress of this painting that I could spend a lot of time with. I recognize the limitation of the technology of eye tracking. After all, when we look at art, typically we look at detail, and then we zoom out and look at those details in context. We zoom in and zoom out. In fact, sometimes we physically step back to look at a painting, a large painting, and then step back in. But our eyes certainly provide us with that capability. So with that enhanced capability that we have to zoom in and zoom out, which we couldn't see in the film, but we do all the time to negotiate our spaces we're in, how does this help aid our perception of image and space?
Being able to zoom in and zoom out?
Yes.
Well, in general, I think it aids by being able to, look at the detail, look at the context. So that's kind of the zooming in and out. Where it becomes interesting, and I don't really have the answers, when it's a non-representational art form. And I think that part of the reason why, with the participants that we saw in the film, why they kept going back to that central location was that it was representational. And so I think that by nature we're always trying to make meaning, and we're seeking ways to make meaning. And those look like houses, those look like people. That's something that we can make meaning from. But then we're trying to put it within the context, the broader context. So we zoom out and try to put it within the context, and that's where it kind of falls apart. And I think that's part of what the artist is trying to do, is to break our normal ways of meaning making.
How about in the real world, though, where we must take in detail? For instance, you showed images of novice drivers and experienced drivers. Clearly, they're scanning the scene differently. They're choosing to take in different information, thinking that it's more important. We would like to think that the more experienced driver recognizes what's more important, the cars in the other lane versus what is on the curb.
Right.
So how in the real world, the fact that we can very rapidly move in and out and scan a scene, how does all of that visual capability aid us?
Well, as you said, it helps us make sense of the scene. One of the things that the experts are able to do is integrate all these things into a way that's coherent that the novice can't. And so the novice will fixate on something that's maybe interesting, but doesn't give them the whole picture. And so being able to, like a famous example comes from chess experts, where they will have a chessboard and they can look at it and glance at 3 or 4 spots on the chessboard and for quickly, and then know the whole scene because it makes sense to them because they're experts.
Interesting.
Whereas novices, even if they know the rules, will try to look at every piece and remember every piece. And so as you become an expert in a field, in something, you only have to look at a few places to understand the broader context, the broader meaning.
That's very interesting, because to return to the painting, you would see, it appeared as though the people scanning the image really weren't taking in all of the image. And yet you'd think that at the end of the period they stared at it, you would think that they would say, I've seen this painting. So there must be something about sort of peripheral vision, that non-foveal vision, where we don't have our concentrated gaze, but we're still picking up information.
I kind of see it as, yes, we definitely pick up information from peripheral vision. And you know, where we choose to go to next with our spotlight of attention comes from peripheral vision. And it will be dependent on our expertise, what we know, what our goals, our objectives. And so, you know, that's, which of course, being able to know what's important depends on your expertise in the field.
And that reminds me of another thing, that sometimes I've read that sometimes eye tracking as a technology is criticized because we are thinking of something other than what we're looking at. Could you address that?
That is possible. I think that is one of the limitations in a lot of psychological measures. We don't know how engaged our participants are, and so we try to do things, you know, after the fact. You know, ask them, were you paying attention? Were we thinking? Thinking about the painting. You know, it's kind of a check and balance to make sure that we're actually not getting noisy data, as we would say.
Noisy data, inaccuracies in there.
Yes.
Do we have a question from the audience? Could you please take the microphone? I'd appreciate that very much if you would. Thanks.
Yeah, in dynamic situations, it might get a little more complicated. About 30 years ago, I had, I guess, the pleasure of recording eye movements from Jackie Stewart, the race car driver, who was sort of an ornery little character. I asked him to follow a target that moved predictably from left and right, and he wouldn't follow it. He would always predict where it would go. So I said, why aren't you following the target? He says, well, one of the most important things for a race car driver and driving in these dynamic situations is predicting what's going to happen. So you can imagine going down a scene, walking down a hallway, or whatever, that you might not look at where the object is, but you're looking at where the object might be at some other time as a precaution or as a way to, he said, this is the way I don't get killed. Right. So it's kind of interesting. It gets at higher level of prediction and other kinds of anticipation and interest and all kinds of, you know, your past memory is going to also mirror and paint how we look at something. So it gets at all kinds of levels of attention and whatnot. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks.
I thought all a race car driver had to know was how to turn left, how to turn left, how to turn left.
Actually, one direction, there was no oval.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Dr. Zikos, may I ask, in fact, if you'll allow the other questioner, because we have limited time. Thank you, I appreciate that.
About the baby human YouTube video that you showed, I noticed that both small children were wearing the same bright orange color shirt, and I also noticed that the first toy that they were trying to get the attention of the boy was the same bright orange as the t-shirts that they were wearing, and I was wondering if you felt there was any significance in this bright color being on both of them and the similarity in the color of the toy that they were focusing on.
Well, we know there are certain things that grab attention even with young children, such as bright colors and you know, kids like shiny things and bright, vibrant colors. And so that's why the toy was a vibrant color. In fact, one of the things, one of my friends has done research with Sesame Street. One of the things that they do to test whether or not a new video segment is engaging for infants is they'll have a brightly colored object that they hold off to the side, and to see if the kids will look at the new segment or will look at the bright colored object. So.
But you think that the fact that they were wearing the same color and that the toy was the same color as what they were wearing, that's probably just arbitrary detail?
I think it's a coincidence.
I'm afraid that probably we should move on, and while we are scheduled to have a break now, I think that we'll have to make it a shorter break than we had planned on. But oh, please, Dr. Zikos.
Because when we're discussing about eye movements, we're looking at attention, and I just want to sort of take a step back, because when we move our eyes, we're sort of filling in detail. It's not like that's the only place you're looking. you have in your brain sort of a cognitive model of what you're looking, and you're sort of building it with your eye movements. So it's not that you're only paying attention to that. You're filling in the picture as you're looking around. So you do create sort of your internal model of that, and your eye movements will show where you paid more attention, but that's not the only place you're looked at. You do end up with a complete picture, even though you looked at parts.
Interesting, interesting. Well, thank you for that remark, and thanks, Bruce.